Well, thank you all for being here. I'm using the microphone so the folks online can hear us. So I spoke during services about several different ways that we can all support trans and non-binary youth right now. And I have a handout to give to you all that has more information about those specific ways, and happy to go through that, but I wanted to start before we did that just to see if there were questions or clarifications that folks wanted from what I said earlier. And we have a microphone that you can use, please.
Well, I was just reading about the Supreme Court decision that has to do with Maryland and the LGBTQ, and the reading and how the parents can pull their kids out of the class. And I'm thinking, this is happening in Maryland.
It's happening in Montgomery County.
And in Montgomery County.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, sort of how does, it's impeding the education of fellow students if they can't, I mean, if students not being able to, but it's just really disappointing, and it just seems like a slippery slope from there.
Yeah, and that's the sort of religious freedom argument is one of the arguments that's used a lot of times in cases around LGBTQ issues, and which is one of the reasons why Keshet has grown our advocacy work as much as we have in the last 5 years, because it actually does make a difference when we go to legislators and we can say, we are also people of faith, and we actually believe and support these things, and we know that you're hearing from other people of faith who don't, but we do. So it's definitely, it's a strong argument that is often used and one that we try to counter.
Has your support and, you know, in response to all this, has there been an outpouring of more support for Keshet, or would you say that it's stayed the same, or how are people in the public reacting to it?
So I think there are 3 different ways I'd answer that. We've definitely gotten a lot more coverage in the media and newspapers wanting to interview folks on our staff, things like that. We have definitely gotten a lot more interest in engaging with Keshet in resources, the Pledge for Trans Dignity. When we did a online session to roll that out, we had something like 300 people on it, which was the largest online thing that we'd ever done. And we have definitely raised a good bit of money since the inauguration, but also, as Scott said, our CEO, who's been there for 24 years, is leaving, and it's hard to differentiate that sort of increase in fundraising between what's going on and her leaving, so that's hard to say.
Can you say a little bit more about I believe you mentioned the New York Hebrew Free Loan Society, and what specifically it does for families?
Yeah, so it's actually something, when the election happened, our CEO reached out to a bunch of different Jewish organizations and sort of put the bug in people's ear that there were going to be people who needed to move and might need support in doing that, and didn't initially get a whole lot of traction for it, but then right around the inauguration, Rabbi David Rosen, who runs the Hebrew Free Loan Society, reached back out, and out of that conversation grew something that's called Move to Thrive, that initially, the funding comes to the Hebrew Free Loan Society. Initially, Keshet was actually doing the reading of the applications and sort of vetting of applications. Now it's all fully been taken on by Hebrew Free Loan Society, but the idea is that they're still trying to raise more money because they had an initial $60,000 grant that went like in a couple weeks. So they're raising more money, and the idea is that families can get a grant of up to $10,000 that's interest-free, that they can use to cover whatever it is that they need to do to be able to move from whatever state they're in to someplace that their kids are safer, able to access care, et cetera.
And is there an expectation that more states are going to be following? Was it South Carolina that just got, which was the most recent Supreme Court decision that?
Tennessee.
Tennessee?
Are you talking about Scrimetti?
Yeah. Do you anticipate more states are going to follow that haven't already?
I mean, it's likely. That's what we have seen, is that a bill is sort of tested out in one state, and when it gets traction in one state, they just sort of cut and paste it across other states that they think are going to be receptive to it. That particular ruling is very specific to the facts of the Tennessee case. So the ruling itself isn't going to be able to be applicable and to directly keep care from kids in other states, but the idea that the Supreme Court is in support of that is going to embolden other legislators for sure.
Do people have to prove their Jewishness to get these loans from the Hebrew? So it's available to somebody who's not affiliated and has no Jewish connection?
That's a great question. I have not actually looked at the exact application, so I'm not sure exactly what it asks about. Scott said he spoke to David, and he doesn't think that there's any kind of... Generally, Hebrew fluent doesn't distinguish.
Thank you.
Thanks. I shared with Suzanne a few minutes ago, we have a trans granddaughter who has the joy and misfortune of living in New Orleans. And so New Orleans is a wonderful place, and her educational environment in the public system has been very positive, but it's still very challenging, and she can't get any care in Louisiana. So she comes up here, she gets her care at Hopkins, which, thanks, but everybody, thanks to those who listen from above, that's still the case. So I have two questions, one specifically to that, and what can we do, and what are organizations like yours doing to keep those providers sort of safe in order for them to continue to provide care? So that's part one. Part two is a totally different one, but something I just thought I'd share with the group. So, of course, I saw you had a flyer. If you're in a blue state, what can you do? I haven't read it yet, but I'm real curious about that. Of course, we have these wonderful Congress people and senators who I at least am fairly confident, are very supportive of us and of my grandchild. But every month, Senator Van Hollen sends out a long flyer about all the issues that he's working on. He also has words of support for federal employees, for immigrants, et cetera. He has never said anything about LGBTQ people in that. And so every month I send a letter to Senator Van Hollen going, "Hi, Senator Van Hollen, it's me again. I have a trans granddaughter. She gets her care at Hopkins. She's a very important part of my life. What are you doing to keep her safe?" Silence. And most recently, I said I would also like to meet with a member of your staff to understand why you've been silent on this issue. And there's no response there. So that's obviously a very different question, but I'm very disappointed in Van Hollen, and I know he's busy. I know his staff is busy, and I know they get 10 trillion letters and emails. But what is it about leaders who are afraid to talk about LGBTQ issues?
So in terms of providers and keeping providers safe, it's not something we explicitly work on. A lot of organizations, a lot of progressive organizations in general, and a lot of LGBTQ organizations in particular, have been thinking a lot about cybersecurity and other kinds of security for their staff. So we are investing in, and a lot of other organizations have invested in things like services that will essentially scour the internet and take off like personal addresses, personal email addresses, personal phone numbers, all of that, anywhere that they can find it, both on sort of the generally accessible part of the web as well as the underbelly of it. So that kind of thing, so that people can't be doxxed, they can't be found. That's definitely one big thing that a lot of organizations are trying to do, and just generally thinking more specifically about security. Honestly, for folks in the South, like providers in the South, it's not a new issue. In right now, it's been an issue for years. So it's something that they've been thinking about for a while, and interestingly, what we saw after the elections, we started in Boston. We're a national organization now, but we have staff all over the country, including a bunch of staff in Florida and several in Texas. And one thing we saw after the election was that our southern staff, our northern staff were like, the world is ending, like it's horrible, everything is awful. And our folks in the South are sort of like, we've been living under this kind of like horrible rule of law for the last, however many years. So like, yeah, it's bad that the president is also now in support of this, but like, it's been bad here for a while. So folks in the South who are working on these issues have been thinking about this for much longer than just since January or since November. In terms, I don't know about Van Hollen specifically. It sounds like you're doing all the things that one would encourage doing. I mean, it's tricky because LGBTQ issues have become a politicized issue. Oftentimes, legislators don't want to engage on that particular issue because they think that they're going to lose support somewhere in their constituency. So that is oftentimes, and one of the things we talk about a lot when we do our work out in the Jewish community is the idea that being queer, being trans has been politicized, but that doesn't mean it's political. Like, we are just people, we're just human beings, and our rights are the same as everyone else's rights. It doesn't, just because people are trying to politicize it and make it an issue around politics doesn't actually mean that it is. So that idea of being politicized versus political is one that we found to be really helpful in helping people sort of differentiate the two. Yeah. Hold on for one question. Hold on for the microphone.
Have you tried to contact Angela Alsobrooks?
I haven't, and I should, but I'm responding specifically to the fact that he's silent. I have
Yeah.
no issues. I need to explore that, but I just find it puzzling if nothing else. But I know. Sorry. No, sorry. Yeah. So no, I haven't followed up with Senator Alsobrooks. I need to do that, but. I know sometimes, as you said, people don't want to agitate their constituents, and so I'm curious if that's the case, but haven't gotten no response. And again, maybe it's more a logistics and paperwork issue than a objection to the concern. It just doesn't seem. Phil's just shaking her head. It just doesn't seem right. And again, acknowledging the value. That what was your first thing of your 5? Recommendations is to acknowledge and believe people, to acknowledge that they are part of our society, to acknowledge that they exist, and acknowledge their value to our society.
Yep.
And in the case of these teenagers, I think it's life-saving. And so, I've written to a number of other people. I've written to Hopkins a number of times, and I say, I'm counting on you to keep my granddaughter safe. And I'm counting on Van Hollen to keep my granddaughter safe too, even though she's not his constituent, but I am. So.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we've also been encouraging folks to think about is the idea of not complying before something is actually required. So for example, when the Scrimetti decision about Tennessee came out, there were organizations that sent out a newsletter to their constituency saying, gender-affirming care has been banned, which is not a helpful, that is not in fact what that decision was about. It was very specifically about that case in Tennessee in those particular circumstances. And so the idea that when the initial bans came out at the beginning of the administration, they weren't actually law. They had no teeth behind them, and yet Children's Hospital even, I don't know about Hopkins, but I know Children's Hospital shut down their care for a while. And so the idea of don't actually do something you don't have to do until you actually are going to have some kind of significant consequence for not doing it.
So in addition to healthcare, I wanted to talk about mental health care for a minute.
Yeah.
And probably some people know that 988 hotline, which is funded by HHS, was told no more services and supports for LGBTQ folks. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions of organizations. I mean, I know about Trevor Project in New York, but are there other mental health care organizations that are more national scope or even just regional that you can recommend that we support?
So I know Trevor Project is definitely trying. So Trevor Project, when you called 988, there was an option once it was answered that said if you're LGBTQ and want a provider who it specializes in that, you can press, I think it was like 3 or something like that. That would then hook you up to the Trevor Project. So they were the provider for the suicide hotline. And so what they're doing now is trying to make sure that once it is no longer connected to 988, that they can get out the message as widely as possible, that their line is still there, it always has been. You just can't access it directly through the 988 line. And so I think one thing is just making sure that, like, if you know folks who work with teens, if you know folks who work on mental health issues, that they know that that hotline still exists and that they can direct people to that hotline. I mean, Trevor Project is sort of the gold standard for that kind of support. There are other also letting folks know that there are a lot of, in addition to like phone lines, there are a lot of text lines and chat lines, or chat options that are available online where a young person doesn't even have to call and doesn't have to speak to anybody. They can text back and forth with a counselor. They can do a chat online with a counselor. Trevor Project has something called, I think, like Trevor Space, which is a sort of a chat room for youth. It is highly unfortunate that sort of direct line through the national line is not going to exist soon. And there are still lots of options, and really the important thing is making sure that people know about that. It's about sort of getting the word out. Carol?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the Canadian hotline apparently
Yep.
exists too, and
Yes.
it works in the United States.
Yeah, so it didn't used to. And when the decision came out from the U.S. government, the Canadian suicide hotline created a U.S. number so that U.S. people could call the Canadian hotline.
So this is a comment about baby boomers and pronouns.
Great.
Baby boomers in general have an issue with pronouns. And we, meaning me and others, have to really work at it. And I don't know whether it's a training, it's a pamphlet, it's a something that needs to happen. It's not, our brains just take a while to get there. And it's not, trust me, I'm in a world with a lot of pronouns. The JUFJ world is filled with pronouns, and I work really hard at it. But I often don't quite get it right. So what kind of help can you give us?
So there is, in fact, a handout that was just being shown that does some of the explaining, because for some people it isn't about the getting your brain to make the shift. It's the resistance of the idea of they them pronouns not being something that one should use for a single person. So that talks to some of the more ideological pieces of it. There is online, actually on our website, there's a link. S. Bear Bergman, who's a trans Jewish author, has written a bunch of children's books, done a lot of writing online. He has a little graphic pamphlet, essentially, that you can find online that has suggestions exactly for that. I know that I'm supposed to be good at this, but I'm not. What can I do? Is essentially what the pamphlet is about. So checking that pamphlet out. There's also another source online that essentially just does repetition. So it gives you a pronoun, and then it gives you 3 sentences, and you're supposed to read through the sentences with that pronoun, and then it gives you a different pronoun. You read through 3 sentences with that.
Training is exactly what we need.
It's repetition, but it's training that you can do without having to worry about messing it up in front of another person. So it's training you can do sort of in the privacy of your own home.
It's also nice to tag the word language is evolving, if I may co-opt from our particular context. There are still people who say policeman instead of police officer. There are still people who say cameraman instead of camera operator. And many of us worked very hard to say my doctor, he or she, for years, and now going to they is a shift. And I just think we have to accept that language is evolving. If I use terms like Negro or colored people, people would blank. So if I give them a construct where they realize that they are changing language and they will make mistakes and they can persist, I think it helps. And going back to those terms often has a positive versus a negative ramification.
Two things I would add to that. One is teaching people how to mess up. So when you don't use the right pronoun or you don't use the right name, teaching people that the way to respond to that is just to say, oops, correct yourself and move on, rather than, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I just made this horrible mistake. If you make a mistake and then you make it into this big deal, you're putting a bunch of emotion onto the person that you're talking to that they don't really need to deal with. And so if you can sort of internalize your own guilt about having made a mistake and just say, oops, correct yourself and move on, that's less work for the trans person you're talking to. And then the other thing I was going to say, I can't remember, so go ahead.
Let me stall and say one of the things I try and do as an educator is not reference gender or other issues that aren't relevant when they're not. So if I'm telling a story about a kid who was acting out in class, you know, I'm more tempted to use the word asshole because at least it's generic. I'm sorry, no, I don't. That would be unprofessional. But if I can get people laughing and learning at the same time. So if I'm telling a story where a child's package isn't of impact, then I don't reveal those issues because it's not relevant. Did that give you some big time?
I appreciate it, though.
We have a trans child, adult child, and also, is there a better word? Adult child is very clumsy, but anyway, I just wanted to say they are very generous. And, you know, I slip up, you know, and they say, it's okay, you're trying. And there's a lot of forgiveness in the community. The other thing I wanted to mention is that they mentioned that we had pronoun discussions because I'm an old guy and it's hard for my brain to change. And I said, that's never been the case. And they said, Shakespeare used it. Mm-hmm. In cases of undetermined gender, they is used. Yep. And they were right.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that is one of the things that's often shared. I remembered what my thing was. Something to be aware of in any circumstance where you may offend somebody. Sometimes you may make a mistake with pronouns, for example, and someone might respond to you very generously and say, no big deal, moving on. The likelihood is that if somebody responds in a very strong way, that has actually all to do with the trauma that they've had before that particular instance that's happening in that moment, and about that much to do with that particular instance. And so, not that it's easy, but sort of trying to be a screen yourself and let that person's anger at the world just sort of move through you, rather than feeling like you have to hold on to that person's anger, can make it easier in those circumstances when you make a mistake and the response isn't good, to understand that it's actually pretty much zero about you and a lot about all the horrible things that have happened to that person previously. I think we had a hand over here.
So I came late, so I hope, so don't answer if this has already been discussed. I assume this is just general Q&A about trans issues. I hope that's okay. The two political issues that I hear about are trans women in sports and gender-affirming care for minors. Those seem to be, it seems like they tried some other things. There was something about locker rooms at one point or whatever, or there's a little bit about bathrooms sometimes, but that seems to be less of a deal lately for some reason. I don't know why.
It's still a pretty big deal, but yeah, go ahead.
It seems like they're kind of looking for whatever sticks, and those two seem to have really stuck lately anyway. So I know that they're basically manufactured issues, but I don't really know exactly what the arguments would be. The arguments, as you know from the right, are trans women have some unfair physical advantage, And the argument, what was the other thing I was saying? The gender affirming care for minors. The idea is, well, they might change their mind later. And these, I think, was it even in the Supreme Court? The issue was that the claim is that the medical establishment has not fully agreed that this is a good idea. I think that's what they're saying. So I'd just like to hear what the correct or what a reasonable sort of response is to these issues. Thank you.
So I will give a brief one, and then I will direct you to out in the front if they're still there. There's a packet called Trans Myths and Misconceptions or something like that that has a bunch of these things outlined and then gives you like talking points for how to respond when somebody makes that case. So I would encourage folks to take a look at that. Is that on your website too? It is on our website too, yes. Things are a little hard sometimes to find on our website, but it's there. So I'm going to start with gender affirming care because there's more to say about that one. The reality is that gender affirming care means a huge spectrum of things. It can mean everything from a kid wearing gender affirming clothing to mental health care to puberty blockers to surgery. Like, huge spectrum, and the reality is that there are no doctors out there in the United States that are saying a 5-year-old should have gender-affirming surgery. It's just not happening. But the right would like you to think that that is in fact exactly what's happening. We went to a protest at the Supreme Court when the Skrmetti case was being argued. And one of the things that was talked a lot about at that was how much support there in fact is from the medical establishment for gender affirming care. The American Pediatric Association, the American Medical Association, all of the major medical associations of doctors support gender affirming care. The ones that the right is sort of putting forth are not the major scientifically based associations. They're the sort of fringy ones that are out there. So gender affirming care, all of the scientific research that's out there that's actually based in real studies that have large sample sizes, et cetera, those ones are saying that that people do not regret these things, that there is a small percentage who do, but the vast majority don't, that the vast majority's mental health outcomes, physical health outcomes are dramatically better when they have care that is affirming. So that's getting at that particular question.
So the claim that the medical establishment is still undecided, that's just not accurate.
That's just not accurate, yeah. Definitely. In terms of the sports bans, there is so much variation in skill and ability within any particular gender that the idea that like any given person being any particular gender, meaning that they are automatically going to be that much more skilled that it's going to create an unfair advantage, there's way more diversity within women who play sport, within cis women who play sports, than there are necessarily with having a trans woman in those sports with them. The other thing is that when you look at the numbers of trans youth, like trans women who play women's sports, trans men who play men's sports, they're teeny. There's so few youth who are playing the sports that the idea that it's become this huge issue that we have to pay like immense amounts of attention to and have bans and all of that, it's for like this very small minority that are not going to dramatically impact the like trajectory of youth sports.
But just for the devil's advocate on that, when you're talking about like people at the highest levels, like, right, so it's a tiny number of people, but for example, there's a tiny number of people who go to the Olympics, right? So the argument is, yeah, if I go from being the third best in the world to the fourth best in the world, that means I don't go to the Olympics and I don't get that stage, that opportunity. So what do you say to the argument that just because it's a small number, that's not really an argument?
like youth sports are generally not like the number of people who are going to get to the point at that point in their teenage years when they're going to go to the Olympics. Like the percentage of those people who have that level of skill, who are going to get to that level, who also are a trans woman or a trans man, it is such an infinitesimally small percentage that like maybe there can be policies. Do there need to be actual laws, like state and federal laws on it? That I think is the question. Should associations have some kind of like policies within themselves? That's a whole nother issue, but having it be a legal issue that states rule on, that the country rules on, that feels disproportionate.
I think somewhat relevant to this is a realization that I've come to, again, through sharing our granddaughter's experience of how gendered we are as a society. I mean, there's men's bathrooms and women's bathrooms. Do you have men's and women's bathrooms in your house? No.
Nope.
We have Academy Awards for men and for women. We have sports events that only women can compete in, and only men can compete in. We have clothing, boys' clothes and girls' clothes. Some of that is evolving, but I think we need to all be much more aware of how gendered we are in our thinking, and that's how we were raised, and that's our culture. When I was in 6th grade, I went to an elementary school that had 2 doors, the girls' door and the boys' door, and they no longer used it at that time, but when the school had been built in the 30s, the girls went in one side and the boys went in the other side. I don't get it, but we perpetuate a lot of that with so many things that we just kind of take for granted. And so I call on all of us to think about that. I think it's relevant to the sports issue as well, but certainly to lots of other aspects of our lives.
It's super reinforced in schools. They like boys and girls, boys over here, girls over here. Oftentimes when somebody is up on a stage, you'll hear ladies and gentlemen instead of attendees or guests or friends. So yeah, it's in our language, it's in our buildings, our facilities. It really is, and we have become so accustomed to it that unless you have a reason for it to become a thing that sort of ruffles your feathers, most folks don't even notice it that it's there. David?
I was going to ask, what kind of reception are these issues getting, and are you experiencing in your interactions with mainstream Jewish organizations? Where is the sort of organized Jewish world, and maybe even are we right here doing enough or doing the right thing? But really I'm interested more sort of in the world of the Jewish community that you interact with.
So I will say that Keshet does not work with the Orthodox community. There's another organization, ASHL, that specifically works with the Orthodox community. We occasionally work with modern Orthodox institutions, but generally mostly conservative and the others. It varies pretty dramatically. We have a lot of schools, a lot of day schools, a lot of camps, especially camps, a lot of synagogues, social service agencies that are really eager to work on how they can become more inclusive. The one area that we've sort of seen the most resistance to is many of the legacy organizations. So federations, for example, there's some that are great. Boston Federation is awesome. There are others that are very resistant to the idea of even working with Keshet. We had seen some progress being made with JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, with JPRO, which is like a Jewish professionals organization. And since the inauguration, we've seen that backsliding pretty substantially. There was a conference that a bunch of our staff went to that those organizations ran together, that they didn't even have pronouns on the name tags. They used to. The last conference that same organization held, they had pronouns on all the name tags. This one you had to like go to a room that was on a different floor to get the sticker to add to your name tag to have pronouns on your name tag. So a lot of the organizations who, when it was like cool to do it, were doing it. Now, because they see that their more conservative members are sort of following the party line in terms of the administration, they're backing off. JFNA is part of their organization that works on these issues, which used to be called the Jewish Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Initiative, is now called the Jewish Center for Belonging. And JPRO, I believe JPRO they used to have diversity as part of their vision statement and actually actively took diversity out of it. So those organizations that are trying to sort of achieve that balance between keeping more progressive members happy and not alienating their more conservative members seem to be leaning much more towards not alienating their conservative members at the moment. Scott?
I just want to say, you're doing a wonderful job of answering everybody's questions. Was there anything that you wanted to say besides answering questions?
I was going to share this document that has some more specifics about things we can take action on. Scott, were you going to say what Ken said, or did you want to ask a question first? Great. Go ahead and ask your question, then we can do this.
This is going to be the most rabbi-y question ever.
Great. I work with some of those.
Sorry about that. I really like gender. Like I enjoy it. I enjoy investing in it. One of the things I really appreciate about the trans people in my life is they've expanded what gender can mean. And so, you know, in the bell curve that sort of describes humanity, like when I once quoted Kate Bornstein a few weeks ago, like I think Kate's someone who like has this really expansive view. I mostly encounter, I wouldn't call them philosophies because they're more like talking points that I just don't understand. I don't understand, or sort of like from the left, right, and center, it just doesn't, it seems very unhelpful. You know, there are only boys and girls, you know, there's only boys and girls from the right. I once heard someone say, your gender can be anything you want to, it can be pizza. If you, and I like, thank you for the response. And so like, I've heard gender is a social construct, we need to gender things, and that personally does not ring true in terms of the breadth of human experience, and also my desire to sort of celebrate the expansiveness of who and what we are. So I'm curious, like, do you know people that I should be reading or thinking about? Because I've had a hard time finding teachers in this regard.
I mean, the way that we talk about it at Keshet is not like it shouldn't exist. That we talk about it depending on the person on staff you talk to. Sometimes it's a spectrum, sometimes it's like a galaxy because a line is too linear. I can't even. But there are lots of other sort of ways to think about it that are not just like either you have it or you don't have anything. I think the idea. The idea that is actually going to get any traction, because the idea of getting rid of gender altogether is just, it's never going to get traction in a significant enough way to make it be a widely held belief. That I think the idea that we can, that there is not just a binary of male and female, that there is expansiveness within both of those categories, but also between those categories and outside. The idea of there are people who identify as agender, they don't identify as having a gender at all. And so both the idea of like there being a spectrum, there being a galaxy, however you want to describe it, and also that acceptance that I was talking about before of like people know their own identity, they know how they feel in their bodies, and so being able to accept that. In terms of specific people to read, I will think about that. And
like, should I call Bear or something? Okay.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll think about other specific people. Can we do this, or do you? One last question.
Sort of piggybacking on that, I heard Pete Buttigieg about 2 weeks ago say that the left has overplayed the pronoun issue, and that and he's looking at it from a political standpoint. He wants to run for president. God, I hope he does. But you know, there are political realities. That's not a hill that we should die on, he said. We have to pick our fights very intelligently. Now, amongst ourselves and amongst our community and our friends, I'm perfectly happy doing that. But from a political standpoint, I think we need to, I hate to say this, I think we need to retrench and find the things we can win on.
That is not my area of expertise, so I don't have a lot to say about that, other than that politics is made up of human beings, and if we get too focused on the political wins and we stop paying attention to the human beings that are involved, we get in real trouble. Yeah. So does everybody, one more question.
I don't know if I have a question, but I do have an analogy. When I was a teenager, growing up in the Detroit area, I was sent to some kind of teen seminar at Wayne State University. And there was a remarkable woman scholar who was speaking on the subject of race. Bear with me, because there's the analogy right there. And she gave a very well-reasoned, research-supported talk about how race was a social construct. Now, she was very clear at the end of her talk, I remember, that, of course, politics hasn't caught up with that reality. But I think it's kind of a helpful analogy for this whole discussion that, you know, there's this spectrum out there, there's a ton of ways we talk about it, and then there's all the ways it's been politicized.
Yeah, definitely. So folks have this in front of them. There are lots of things we can do, and I think sometimes when we look at what's happening policy-wise, government-wise, state-wise, it's easy to just sort of throw your hands up and be like, this is impossible, we're never gonna make a difference. And the reality is that there are huge differences that we can make on a much more small scale by taking actions that aren't honestly big ones. So things like just having the trans Jews belong here signs up around Jewish institutions makes a huge difference. We've had our executive director, our CEO, after the 2016 election, someone told them a story of how they were a teacher or guidance counselor in a school and had a student who was like very distraught over the outcome of the election and had been walking by this professor or this teacher's room and saw a Keshet Safe Zone sticker on them, and that sort of gave them the like little bit of a nudge that they needed to sit down with that adult and like really have somebody that they could talk to and that they could sort of depend on in that moment. So like very small things can make a huge difference to individual queer, trans folks, especially young people. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the things on here. We have something called Thrive that we started a couple years ago. Adat Shalom proudly is part of Thrive. So that has checkmark, done that. If you belong to other Jewish organizations who are not part of Thrive, I would encourage you to check that out. We have monthly meetings where our staff walks through current updates around legislation that's going on related to trans youth, and gives folks skills around writing op-eds, around lobbying, around different actions that their institutions can take. We have something over like 280 Jewish organizations that are part of that, and a good like 30 to 40 show up on a regular basis to those monthly calls. We've got the pledge that the QR code is out there for, and then we do quite a bit of work with elected officials. We have postcards that we ask folks to fill out to send to their legislators. We have online actions that we take. Right now, there's not a lot of federal legislation to take much action on, but there are things in states. In Texas last year, we helped to prevent the chaplaincy bills that they were trying to pass, where they were going to put Christian chaplains into public schools as guidance counselors. What? Untrained Christian clergy into public schools as guidance counselors, and Keshet helped to organize the progressive community in Texas to be able to overturn some of those. So there are small wins that we can have. They're usually on the local, state levels, not on the national level at this point. Even honestly, under the Biden administration, that was often true too. Lots of ways you can educate yourself, lots of things to read, lots of resources on Keshet's website. If you belong to other Jewish organizations, we have an amazing team of 10 staff and something like 30 contract trainers who do all kinds of different educational trainings. They do everything from your sort of basic LGBTQ 101 to trans inclusion in the Jewish workplace, to things around like how as a clergy person to talk about LGBTQ issues within the context of Torah, like all of that and beyond. So encouraging other Jewish institutions, or this one, to bring those kinds of trainings in. And also working, because some of the small things are actually a big deal, even just working with the JCC that you belong to, for example, oftentimes JCCs have a security person at the front of the building, and when they ask for identification, that's like has challenges around a whole lot of things, including that it's often like has some like racial profiling issues that go along with it, but it's also a really big deal for trans members because they don't always have an ID that matches either their current, how they currently look or their current name. And so training for even the security folks at the front of the JCCs can be critical in having trans folks feel like they belong in Jewish institutions just as soon as they walk into the door. Similarly, in a synagogue, not making assumptions about, in a synagogue where there are differentiations on who wears a kippah and who doesn't wear a kippah, not making an assumption over who should have a kippah on and who should not have a kippah on, not assuming that if you're asking kids to put them on, not assuming the gender of the children. There's just all this very tiny little actions that can be taken, making sure that places where you're making name tags have a place to put pronouns on the name tags, making sure that you have people's preferred names. There's often not a place, if you're both trying to collect legal information and sort of day-to-day information, if you only put a place for one name, somebody to give you their legal name may not actually be the name that they want to be referred by. And so if there isn't a place, if there isn't an option for a preferred name, or there are lots of different ways you can label that, but if you don't have that, you're often gonna not have the name that somebody wants to be referred to. Forms, we have a whole bunch of resources about forms. Forms are a challenge, and honestly, the Jewish companies that run all of the CRMs, the databases that many synagogues use have not gotten to where they need to get to in terms of things around pronouns, gender options, preferred names. We've pushed them, and there just hasn't been a lot of movement. So forms are actually a pretty big deal. And also just representation in the same way that like it's important for Jews of color to see themselves in Jewish institutions. It's important for queer and trans people to see themselves in Jewish institutions, to see themselves in the leadership, to see themselves in the kinds of imagery that's up, the kind of art, the kind of photography, what's on the website, what's on the pamphlets, and at the same time, not have that be tokenizing. Oftentimes what happens is you have one trans person or one queer couple in an organization, and every time a new trans person comes as a guest, that same group of people or that same couple is brought and be like, look, we have our queer people, we queer people belong here, we have a trans person, which is well-intentioned. That's never happened, right? It's well-intentioned, and it also doesn't feel great on the receiving end. Another one of the resources that's actually like literally just went up on our website this week is called Tokenism versus Representation, I think, or something like that, and specifically about this idea of like how do you balance out wanting to have representation of the diversity of the Jewish community in your institution while doing it in a way that doesn't tokenize the one queer family, the one trans Jew, the one Jew of color in the process of doing that. Yeah, wait for the microphone though.
In what? Yeah, that's fine. Okay. In some progressive schools or camps or organizations, regularly, like every semester, students are asked their preferred name and their preferred pronouns because they're not very stable in kids, who are thinking about gender issues. But it would also be nice in large institutions where you're sending out stuff annually for membership to ask people if they have a preferred name. It's a really easy way to allow people to update themselves without having to go to, the trouble of contacting the office themselves, and to normalize that people can do that, just, along with updating other things. Note to the synagogue, it would be really helpful if after the third time you could take my old landline off, because that's how people try to contact us and they don't get to us. But, kind of like that, right? Like, things get updated about people, and rather than putting the onus on each member individually, it would be really great to have a way that everyone can either check, this is all still the same, or I have changes to make.
Yeah, that's also why the recommendation is not to ask people's pronouns once and then have that just be printed on everything forever, but to actually leave the pronoun section open and have either each time you're needing to make name tags, having people enter it into whatever registration form they're using, or just have a space and then have stickers, have pins, have whatever you can add to it, so that if things change, like even amongst our staff who are queer and trans Jewish professionals, at least one of the people that I have supervised over the time that I've supervised them has changed which pronouns they use. And this is somebody who's in their 30s. So it's not just youth, though they do it a lot, but it is folks across the age spectrum who just come to a realization of like more clarity about their gender, and that can happen at any time. So yeah, totally agree. Local Jewish, on the last page, number 8, contacting local and Jewish media. God bless the Jewish media, they're not very good on this issue. They really aren't. And especially when it comes to things around pride, when things around the intersection of anti-Semitism and anti-LGBTQ stuff, there is a lot of trying to take the nuance out of things, and to say that like all non-Jewish queer people are anti-Semitic, or all Jewish people are anti-LGBTQ. And as we know, nuance is everything, and people are rarely one thing or another. And so keeping a critical eye to what you're seeing in the Jewish media, and encouraging them to think about it when they try to make those sort of blanket assessments about things, or when they misgender somebody, or when they trying to think of other examples. We've created a resource, because oftentimes what we found is when the Jewish media wants to talk to either one of our staff or one of our constituents, that they don't know how to talk to trans folks. They don't know how to have that conversation in a way that isn't tokenizing, that isn't leaving that person feeling like they have a bad taste in their mouth. And so encouraging, if you have colleagues that are in the media, encouraging them also to do that kind of education that we were talking about before, to learn sort of how is it that you do interviews in a way that is respectful and makes people feel dignified coming out of it, rather than sort of icky coming out of it. And then there are lots of organizations out there doing great work. Number 10, Keshet, obviously, believe in that one. But there are lots of other organizations, both in the Jewish community and out. Trevor Project is another fabulous one. And there are tons of organizations locally in states that are doing great work. We have a listing on our website specifically in our target states nationally and in Massachusetts, because that's where we started, of organizations that are doing work in this area specifically to support trans folks, that if you're looking for organizations to support is a great place to start. So that is some great options. I can take like 2 or 3 more questions.
Do you, as an organization, have an opinion or a stance or a policy on legal name changing? Because that cuts a lot of that stuff out. You know, my legal name is this, you'll call me this. That's it.
No.
Not gender, I mean gender, of course. If it's a name like Chris, you know, go either way, but, you know.
From our perspective, like, everybody should have the right and the ability to make those decisions for themselves. For some people, there are reasons why it doesn't make sense for them to do a legal name change. For other people, that's exactly what they need. And everybody knows their own situations much better than we do or legislators do. So, yeah. Jacob.
I was listening to the list of things that we can do and thinking back, Carol, to what you said about it can be hard as boomers to get our heads around this. And I think one particular thing I've seen be really, really valuable is when somebody doesn't understand something, having somebody who is a peer sit down next to and just talk to them in as a friend of, I hear you using this pronoun. I also have been working my way through pronoun challenges. Here's how I've approached it. I've seen the most effective way of helping people. This is not when folks are trying very hard and like not quite, making missteps, but for folks, as we said, a lot of folks who are like, they don't believe it is a pronoun, not a singular, and to have, in addition to having someone from the front, experts in the community, having peers speak to each other to help make the case is a really valuable step. And so something that each of us can do, not only around age peers, but also just through friendship. Relationships matter to these kinds of conversations.
I will take that as an opportunity to also say that's part of what I think has been so effective for Keshet, is that the approach that we have always taken has been one of meeting people where they're at. So not coming in with a sense of you're wrong, you're doing it wrong, you're hurting people, you're like not using shame as a way to change people, because shame does not in fact create long-term change. It can sometimes create short-term change, but it does not create long-term change. And so coming into these conversations with the assumption that we're all here for the right reasons and that we all want to do the right thing has been much more effective for us in seeing the change that we wanted to see in the Jewish community, and leaning into relationships. That's what, we have had some pretty difficult situations in the last couple of years around conferences, around pride events, where there's been a lot of resistance to the idea of a Jewish group doing X, Y, or Z. And if we had been confronted with the idea of a certain topic being on the agenda, or us not being allowed to be in the front part of the Pride Parade because the war in Iran started, no joke, that was a thing this week. The real way that we have made those things happen and gotten past those things is leaning into the relationships that our staff have with the people who are making those decisions and saying, like, I know that you don't want to be communicating the thing that you're communicating right now. Here's how it's coming across to me as a person that you have a relationship with, rather than just saying, oh, you're being anti-Semitic, like, see you, we're out the door. That doesn't actually get us anywhere, and that oftentimes for even some other Jewish LGBTQ organizations is the approach, is to say, like, you're being anti-Semitic, we're gonna leave now, rather than wow, that was kind of hurtful. Like, can we sit down and have a conversation about how that felt when you said that, or when you said that we needed to do X, Y, or Z? We have found a lot more success with large organizations having those conversations through relationship than sort of shutting the door and trying to create change through not being present, which generally doesn't work. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay, Scott's giving me this. Do you want to say anything to close out?
Thank you. We really appreciate you. You're wonderful. Thank you for doing it.